You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 456 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show today is Will Porter. Will is a writer at RT. If you follow him on Facebook, which is just his name, Will Porter, or over on Twitter at WKP ANCAP, you see all the stories that he writes, he posts up there. And so there's a lot of really good takes on current events issues, and certainly he contributes to the news roundups I put out over at the Libertarian Institute with all this content. So, Will, welcome back to the show. How you doing today?
Hey, good, Kyle. I'm glad to be back. How you doing?
I'm doing well. And, excited about today's show because we got a whole bunch of news to run through. Basically, I knew Will had written about a few stories that had happened the week I was, kind of out from the show sick. And to catch us back up on those, I brought Will on the show today. And I think the first one's probably one of the more important ones and something that I really want to touch on the show because Will, being from the libertarian community, the person involved here has a little bit of a reputation. So sometimes maybe you want to instinctually be opposed to her. But in this case, she's fighting a very important fight. So why don't you tell us what Abby Martin is up to and why she's suing, I believe, the state of Georgia.
Yeah, that's right. Abby Martin, who's actually a former host on RT, she had a show on there for a few years called Breaking the Set. And if you want to talk about like the circumstances under which she quit and all that stuff, we can talk about that too. But she was recently barred from giving this keynote speech at a media literacy conference at Georgia Southern University in the state of Georgia, of course. And it sounds kind of crazy, but this happened basically because she refused to sign this like loyalty pledge to the state of Israel. And you may have even mentioned these on the show before, but in 27 or 28 U.S. states, there are these laws that prohibit the state governments from hiring out contractors who support the boycott of Israeli products or support like the broader boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, or BDS. And so the laws kind of differ. The language, the specific language differs from state to state, but usually they prohibit contractors like making above a certain amount of money. So like I think in Georgia's case, it was over $1,000. Like any contractor making over a public contractor making over $1,000 has to agree to this pledge. And actually, an interesting side note, just the other day, the Israeli Prime Minister's office, for some reason, tweeted out that they had promoted these same anti-BDS laws in, quote, most U.S. states. And so this is clearly a result of like the Israel lobby pushing for these things in this country. But nonetheless, in Abby Martin's case, she was supposed to be paid by the university. It's a public university for her talk at this conference. And so in her contract, she was asked to sign this thing where she basically had to agree not to boycott Israel on the basis of this law. And of course, Abby Martin, being like a leftist and an advocate of the Palestinian cause, she actually had just released a film about Israel called Gaza Fights for Freedom. So you can kind of guess where she stands on that issue. She refused to sign this pledge. And so the university immediately canceled her talk. And then when some of the other speakers at the event like tried to object and come to her defense, they just call off the entire event. They canceled the whole conference. And so it kind of became this controversy. And so now Abby is suing the state of Georgia over this. And she's arguing that like these loyalty oaths are completely unconstitutional and that they impose like governmental limits on speech that's clearly protected under the First Amendment. And it's not so much that these laws like prohibit the speech altogether, because obviously the contractors can still say whatever they want in a private capacity. But this is still the government basically like penalizing a certain viewpoint. Like they're dictating the content of viewpoints. And they're not supposed to do that. They're supposed to be neutral on things like that. And so the lawsuit is still kind of in its early stages, so there's not much to say about it at this point. But Abby may have some good chance of doing some good here. There have actually been 3 judges in Texas, Arizona, and Kansas that have ruled similar laws unconstitutional and that they're a violation of the First Amendment and free speech. So Abby may have some, chance here to win, to strike a blow for free speech.
Yeah, so let's talk about the First Amendment issue just a little bit more here, Will, because from our libertarian position, that's why these laws are just so terrible. Is particularly talking about just not being able to say that you're boycotting a country and then following through with that. I suppose it really wouldn't be possible for the state to force you to buy Israeli products of any kind. Although, I shouldn't get too ahead of myself on that because who knows, how crazy, one of these laws in states could be. So basically what, they're stifling her free speech, her ability to go out there and say that, I'm deciding to boycott the state of Israel because of, these crimes. And I've had Scott on the show to talk about the crimes of Israel before, and I don't think that's something my audience needs a huge reminder of today, but just, in the recent years, protesters at the Great Return March, over 200 being killed by Israeli snipers during that time. So that's enough right there to kind of just understand the extent of the war crimes just in the past few years. And that's what, she's saying, that she has the right to boycott and going against that. And, just as always, to disclaim here, when we're talking about boycotting Israel, that's something to be supportive of. And I'm not a fan when it comes to the BDS movement of actually placing sanctions on Israel, but certainly maybe interpret the sanctions as just removing the military aid or something like that.
Right. Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing, that like as libertarians, we mostly, at least I know you and I do, we're more B and D, like boycott and divestment. Like those things are fine. We're not so much down with sanctions, but certainly, yeah, revoking the military aid and stuff, yeah, that would be part of that. And yeah, like these laws are just, there is a massive free speech issue with them because they are dictating the content that, yes, it's not simply like, I've seen some reporting get this wrong and say that, oh, it's like you can't do business at all in the state of Georgia. Like, no, the actual law prohibits public contractors from expressing these viewpoints. But nonetheless, that's still, like an unjustifiable imposition on people's speech.
Right. Well, and one of the things that came up in, I believe, Texas is that this actually applied to teachers or anybody who worked with public schools. And so, just imagine that you got this public school system churning out whatever majority percent of American kids, right? And every single person that works for that cannot have this viewpoint. It's impossible to be a teacher and to, advocate for boycotting Israel. Now, I'm sure there's plenty of, right-wing teachers out there that are just fine with, boycotting or, saying bad things about Palestinians or Arabs more broadly. And that's fine. But in general, you're not going to be able to, have the position to boycott Israel. I think it just goes to show how, the system is going to make sure that we continue with this, high support of Israel, and just kind of that's the establishment position. You have to be supportive of Israel in the U.S.
Right, exactly. And certainly these laws can't make someone in their heart of hearts, someone's going to believe what they're going to believe either way. But this puts restrictions on a public expression of supporting these kind of ideas, supporting a boycott. And so, yeah, it is just kind of a crazy imposition.
So, we know that Abby Martin has filed this lawsuit in Georgia. I guess it's kind of just going to go to determine the state law, though, as far as we understand, that this isn't going to challenge it on a national level. Because as you start out here, we've had these laws passed in 20-something states. Now, there's been a couple, Kansas and Texas being two that stand out, where it's been, I believe, challenged and struck down. But on the whole, that this is still something that's very prevalent in the country.
Yeah, as far as I understand Abby's lawsuit, I think it is just challenging it in Georgia. But I think the more states that overturn this and the more states that challenge it, obviously that sets up better precedent and, for further states to then argue that this is not constitutional.
All right, well, I want to move on to Iraq, where the Iraqi government has asked the United States to leave. And, that they're putting out that they're not going to conduct their anti-ISIS missions with U.S. forces. But, while the U.S. makes up the bulk of the Western forces in Iraq, it's not everything. And there's still a NATO mission and the anti-ISIS mission going on there. So I know you got some news on what's going on with the NATO mission. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, that's right. So just like a couple weeks ago, a week and a half ago, I think, NATO said it would be expanding its mission in Iraq. And specifically, it's talking about its training mission for Iraqi soldiers. And right now, that currently involves like 500 NATO personnel. And of course, they're being opaque about like how many more are going to come and join them. But it's going to be more than the 500 that are already part of this training mission. And it was actually kind of funny. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg came out and announced this move before they'd even gotten the Iraqi government's permission for this. And he kind of acknowledged this in the announcement, saying that like, well, we'll only do this with Baghdad's permission or with their consent. But like they came out and announced it before getting that. And he kind of suggested there was negotiations, there was some kind of talks going on to convince them to allow this, but like there was no verdict on whether they had allowed it. And so I just find that kind of ironic that he came out and announced it before they'd even gotten permission. But the program NATO's training program has actually been on pause for the last few weeks. They froze it after the American assassination of Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad, the head of Iran's Quds Force. And I know you've talked about that a lot on the show. Speaking of countries sort of disregarding Iraq's sovereignty, the way that NATO kind of did by announcing this, that strike was a good example of that too. And so the NATO training mission has been on pause because of that the last few weeks, but they're supposed to be resuming it soon with this like boosted up presence. And at this NATO meeting in Brussels where they announced this expanded mission, U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper was there. And he actually said that he hoped that the ramped up NATO presence in Iraq would allow for the U.S. to sort of scale back our presence there, which I find kind of ironic since just last month, just in January, the U.S. was refusing to even discuss the possibility of a withdrawal with the Iraqi government. And that was after the parliament, had voted to expel all 5,200 or however many American troops are in the country still. So it's really not clear, despite Mark Esper saying like, we'd like NATO to sort of fill the space when we leave. I don't really think it's that clear that they're committed to leaving. You may have seen these news reports that I saw recently saying that the U.S. had planned to pull back troops from 15 bases in Iraq. But I never saw any kind of like official confirmation for that from the Pentagon or the White House or anybody else. And some of those reports were actually saying that they had only intended to pull back troops to larger bases still in Iraq. So just kind of consolidating the presence instead of actually withdrawing it. And I actually saw some reporters saying that these reports were just simply false. That like one Israeli journalist said he talked to an American official, and he said that the U.S. was, quote, continuing its fight with the Iraqi military against ISIS. And that's despite the thing that you said, that the Iraqi military had sort of ordered its guys to not work with the U.S. on the anti-ISIS mission. And so there's all kinds of conflicting reports about like what the U.S. plans to do in terms of a withdrawal. But I do think it was interesting that Esper was even talking about saying that like NATO could sort of, that we'd sort of outsource some of the mission to NATO, and that like they would take some of our, their presence would fill the space when we leave. But like, I don't know, to me, it's not totally clear that they intend to do that at all, because I don't know, the status of American troops there, it's totally unclear whether they're going to leave soon. Maybe you have seen other reports and you can comment on that too.
Well, I haven't, but I just kind of want to go, and ask, what is the mission? I mean, talking about expanding the mission and NATO fighting the mission. What exactly is that? Because it seems at this point, Will, there maybe are a few ISIS guys running around that could cause a little bit of a problem, but mostly that's just taking cheap shots at the Western forces that are stationed in Iraq. And if those forces aren't there, then I'm not sure what they would do. Maybe carry out a few occasional attacks against Shia militias and that, kind of maybe a low simmering counterinsurgency war waged by the Baghdad government. But that can't possibly require thousands of foreign troops to fight. It's not like there's a massive weapons program going on right now in Syria to, fuel any kind of Sunni insurgency to be able to take on I think now the far more strengthened Iraqi military with all the Shia forces militant forces that it has along with it, and that fight alongside against these Sunni groups now. So do you have any idea on what, NATO actually feels like they need to ramp up a mission for?
I mean, they're just saying the training mission. And so, like, of course, they're just using the boilerplate language of like training up Iraqi forces against ISIS, so like it's just sort of like, it's sort of in mission creep mode now, where it's just like, that generic justification to stay there. But yeah, they weren't extremely specific about what this would involve. They didn't even say how many troops would be added to the mission, how many NATO troops would be added to expand, or I think he said enhance the mission. Like I said, there's now 500 who are part of that. I don't think they're even currently doing anything though, because it's been on pause. And so, yeah, it's not totally clear what they hope to accomplish with this expanded mission. And like I said, I'm not like I think it's sort of wishful thinking. I would like to think that the U.S. would leave. Like I would rather NATO. I think I'd rather NATO expand its mission than the U.S. Just because I think a lot of the NATO countries are they're not as gung ho about carrying out strikes like the Soleimani strike. Like, for example, some of our European allies were kind of like wanted to distance themselves from that a little bit. But nonetheless, like I would not jump the gun and say, oh yeah, NATO's about to fill the position when the U.S. leaves. Like, I think we might just be seeing both, an expanded NATO mission and the U.S. there now.
Yeah, that it seems far more likely. Now, the idea that NATO needs to send trainers to Iraq is kind of ridiculous, since the next thing we have to talk about here is the assassination of Soleimani, who was the guy who would be training up the forces in Iraq against the jihadist type forces, the ISIS guys, had Trump decide not to blow him up. Now, the justification for that has been an absolute mess. Right after it happened, I assumed that they would invoke the 2002 AUMF in order to justify this thing. But now we've had several different stories. There were 4 embassies that were going to be attacked. There was this attack and that attack that they claimed, and we have these authorities through section this of the Constitution as commander-in-chief, and the 2002 AUMF, and Soleimani's been designated a terrorist. So Will, what has the White House settled on now, and what do you think? Is there any justification for killing Soleimani at all?
Yeah. So like you said, like right after Soleimani was killed, they started playing up this idea that he was an imminent threat to American interests. They said he was planning planning attacks on the U.S. embassy in Iraq and Baghdad. Trump said he was going to blow it up, like that was his exact words. And then later, like you said, he expanded it to 4 embassies. However, Mark Esper was like at one point was forced to tell a reporter that like he had never seen evidence for 4 embassies, like getting a little carried away now. But nonetheless, the idea that Soleimani was some kind of immediate threat very quickly became the talking point after he was assassinated in January. But in a White House memo just released the other day, the story has changed again. And so now they're sort of downplaying this idea that he was an imminent threat. Like they're downplaying that angle. And now they're saying that we killed Soleimani in response to, quote, a series of attacks in recent months. And of course, they don't like name any of those or provide any evidence or detail whatsoever about what attacks they're talking about. We can presume they're talking about the attack that was blamed on the Shia militia on Kataib Hezbollah, but they just sort of generically say an escalating series of attacks in recent months. And so now apparently they killed this guy in retaliation for something, not to preempt some alleged future threat. And I'm not exactly sure, like, if this has what legal significance this has, like whether it puts the administration on firmer ground legally to say that it was a response to an attack rather than a preemptive strike. But either way, they can't seem to keep this story straight. And the memo, like, of course, didn't get into much detail about this, but nonetheless, you can tell they are sort of shifting the rationale again, saying that, oh, this is a response to, a series of attacks instead of, a preemptive strike.
Right. So it does it seem like, again, you said they're trying to maybe get on a little bit firmer ground with claiming that this was a response rather than preemptive. But even if it's a response, I mean, doesn't there have to be some kind of authorization from Congress, to wage an offensive strike? Since, I mean, it's not like even if it's a response, that doesn't necessarily mean it's, defensive. If you punched me a week ago and then I go up to your house and I punch you in the face, I think I would have a hard time, being able to claim, well, it was in self-defense since a week had gone by and, you were no longer a present threat to me. So assuming that, I could believe Hezbollah was behind those attacks that killed the American contractor on the K1 base, and even that's a pretty wide question now. The New York Times has come out and said that, well, actually ISIS operates in that area. I could believe Hezbollah was on the other side of the Iraqi state. So that seems kind of unlikely. And, just to go through, because I've seen this reported this way a couple times, that it wasn't an attack on the U.S. embassy by a militia, which is the way they make it sound. They say KH, could believe Hezbollah, went and attacked the embassy. And there definitely were some, of their guys there in fatigues, but none of them had weapons. And there were also just a lot of like Iraqi protesters out there in street clothes too. Like
Right.
they felt like Iraqi sovereignty had been violated by the U.S. And so then they went and violated U.S. sovereignty on on our embassy in Baghdad. Right? I kind of felt like that was the response there. But yeah, I mean, is there an assertion of authorization from Congress, or are they just relying maybe on the 2002 AUMF? And I guess at this point, with what Bush and Obama were able to get away with, as long as you made some kind of half-hearted self-defense, then that's going to be good enough.
Yeah, like I don't know how they could possibly justify this with the AUMF, because like that's talking about like Al Qaeda and associated forces or whatever. Like you couldn't even torture that argument to make it justify Soleimani's killing. And so yeah, you would think that they would need some kind of congressional authorization to carry something like this out. And actually, you might recall they had this briefing right after the assassination where Mike Lee, a Republican senator, came out and said that it was like the worst briefing he'd ever seen, and that he was actually extremely angry because this was a joint briefing by the CIA, the State Department, and the Pentagon. And these officials were telling the senators that, like, telling them Congress can't debate any, military action against Iran, and because that would be dangerous and it would embolden them. And so Lee was just saying, like, that's insane, and it is insane. And he was also saying after that briefing that they just had, like, their story is a mess, and so like they've not been able to keep the story straight even from the get-go. It keeps changing, and it's like it's this flimsy narrative that has no good justification factually or legally or constitutionally or whatever. And so, yeah, I guess even during that briefing, he was saying that, like, they're behind closed doors. They have all the time in the world. And these officials still couldn't, provide any better justification than, like, they couldn't provide more detail than, like, what media reports is already giving. And those are already kind of sketchy. And so, yeah, like in terms of the legal basis of it, I think they definitely would have had to get authorization from Congress. I don't know how you could possibly justify this under the AUMF. And then just factually too, like the story has been shifting and changing the entire time. And I don't really think we're ever going to get like like I wouldn't expect one, like a good or reasonable rationale for why this had to happen. I think it's sort of just going to keep morphing and shifting and, until it's sort of forgotten about.
Well, isn't it just even like more of a shame now that Congress, went and spent all their impeachment energy over the fake Russiagate nonsense, rather than they could have now hit Trump with impeachment for abuse of power for attacking Iran when he had no right to. But, that's not, unfortunately, the world we live in. The world we live in apparently has record military high spending. This is a headline that caught my attention. So why don't you talk about worldwide military spending hitting record levels?
Sure. So compared to 2018, this report is talking about 2019. Obviously, we're not far enough into 2020 yet to know. But so compared to 2018, 2019 saw the greatest increase in combined world military spending in a decade. And this is according to this annual assessment that was put out by a group called the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And just from the get-go, I will point out that this group is sort of an establishment think tank. They're based in London. They've been found to take some money from foreign governments like Bahrain, and they're pretty chummy with like the national security establishments in the U.S. and the U.K. So just know that about this group. With that said, though, I don't think I have no immediate reason to doubt their figures, or if anything, they might be downplaying things a little bit, but I think generally this is pretty consistent with things we've seen from other research groups like SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. They've done a lot of similar work, and this is pretty consistent. And so this report by this think tank found that military spending worldwide had jumped 4% overall, which doesn't sound like that much, but that is a greater increase than there's been in a decade, like with the cumulative spending. And in this case, the U.S. and China are sort of tied for the lead in terms of like the biggest increases, which is they're about 6% for both the U.S. and China. That's more than like the world average. However, that's just talking about the rate of growth. So there's a similar rate of growth between the U.S. and China, but on an absolute terms, of course, the U.S. spent way, way more than China. And it was at least $685 billion last year compared to China's $181 billion. And I'm not sure exactly how this think tank is counting its stuff. I'm not sure if it's including like the Department of Energy for the nuclear arsenal and all the other hidden costs that aren't included in the Pentagon budget alone. But this does give you a rough idea of like how much, the spending has increased. Unfortunately, the main study, the main report is behind a paywall. So I've kind of had to rely on like the summaries that this think tank has put out. And they have a bunch of like infographics and charts and stuff with graphs and stuff that I've been able to check out too. And so they found that last year we spent $53.4 billion more on the military in 2019 than we did the previous year. And that figure itself, just the difference between 2018 and 2019, is about equal to the UK's entire yearly budget. So like that 53 billion number, that's how much they spend per year. And that's just how much we increased our budget last year. And sort of consistent with things like Cyprius found previously, we're now outspending the 11 next like biggest military budgets in the world combined. And so all the next spenders behind us, number 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, we spend those next 11 combined. We outspend them. And kind of ironically, most of those 11 countries are U.S. allies too. And so I think this kind of puts things in perspective when you're hearing these dire warnings about, you know, how threatening China and Russia are and stuff. If you look at who's spending what on the military, who is a U.S. ally or whatever, like clearly we way outspend the world, or way outspend these alleged adversaries. And of course, we still call this stuff defense spending, but that's just a total euphemism. Like we're spending billions and billions and now trillions actually at this point of tax dollars are being blown to finance like hundreds of foreign bases and troop deployments. This is not like defensive. This is not defensive spending at all. It's really offensive, aggressive things we're financing with this money. And I would say it's the literal cost of empire, you know, like the monetary cost of empire, maintaining all of this stuff. And that's what we're looking at when we see these soaring defense budgets.
All right, well, I got one more story to get through here, and this is the one. It was, I believe, a Washington Post kind of scoop, and I saw it shared around a lot, so I'm guessing people, kind of caught some of the details of this, but I was really hoping you could lay it out for us. This story that the CIA apparently in part owned a cryptograph company and was just spying on scores of country around the world for decades.
Yeah. So, like, I will say that this story is very long and complex, and I definitely can't get into like every last detail here. This like unfolded over the period of 50 years. So there's like a lot that's been written about it. In addition to what the Washington Post published the other day, because apparently this is something that was kind of well known even before the Washington Post got this scoop. I had just learned about it though, but apparently, like going back and reading, a bunch of people had been talking about this in the years prior. But broadly speaking, yeah, starting in 1970, the CIA and Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service, and actually at the time it was West Germany, East and West Germany were still divided between the Soviet Union and the Western world. But Germany's intelligence agency, the BND, they purchased this Swiss cryptography firm called Crypto AG in 1970. And this company, Crypto AG, made devices that are used for like encrypting and decrypting messages. So like official state communications will put their stuff in like code during wartime, for example, so that like if they're intercepted, they can't be read. Like that's the kind of thing this crypto company dealt in. And the company sold these machines to governments in 120 countries starting after World War II. And for a while, they were like the top company for making these devices, these cryptographic devices. And this company had done business with the U.S. government all throughout World War II. And that's sort of like where the relationship began between, the American government and this company. But in 1970, the CIA and the BND straight up took over this company. They bought it outright in this multi-million-dollar deal. And they started using these devices to spy on a bunch of other countries, like both, enemies and allies alike. And at first they called this Operation Thesaurus, but later it was changed to Rubicon. And so this is Operation Rubicon we're talking about. And the CIA and the BND did not just have some minor sway over this company. Like they didn't just have some input in their decisions. They dominated the company. They controlled every aspect of its operations. They directed they decided who was hired. They, directed sales targets. So like on the business end of it. And then they designed the encryption devices themselves. And I'm not really like well versed in the technology itself to explain exactly how they did this. But basically they installed these vulnerabilities into these devices, or like, covert backdoors they could use to access and read what were meant to be secret communications between other countries. And most of this actually happened during the Cold War, but like it didn't have as big of an impact as you might think, because Russia and China had always been suspicious of this Crypto AG company, and they never did business with it. So but neither of the major Cold War adversaries of the U.S. actually used these devices. But nonetheless, though, the CIA did use these things to spy on India and Pakistan, a bunch of Latin American governments, Iran, and then even like the Vatican. So like a bunch of different, we spied on a bunch of different countries with this. And they were used during some important geopolitical events in history. So they were used to spy on Iranian officials after the revolution in '79 and also during the hostage crisis. We used these things to feed the British intelligence about Argentina during its war with its Falklands War in 1982, which is kind of an interesting sideshow little war to read about. It's a weird little conflict off the coast of Argentina in the 80s. But all throughout the 1980s, 40% of all of the foreign diplomatic cables and government transmissions that were analyzed by the NSA came from crypto AG's devices. And so they were getting a vast amount of information and material through these things. Nearly half of the official communications they intercepted. And as you referred to, this all comes from this classified internal CIA history that was put together by the agency itself. And then somehow the Washington Post got a hold of it. Them, and then there was a Swiss media outlet and a German public broadcaster that they kind of jointly put this out with. I'm not really sure why this was given to them now, and I'm always kind of suspicious about the Washington Post and when they get leaks from the intelligence community and why, and the timing of them. But apparently there's no reason to doubt this. This has kind of been an open secret for a long time, and there had been a lot written about it even prior to the Washington Post report. So there's nothing the revelations aren't exactly new, but we are getting it sort of from the horse's mouth now, from the CIA's own internal history, where they they talked it up and called it the greatest intelligence coup of the century that gave us all this new information. Another interesting point to mention about this thing is how this operation made the intelligence agencies privy to a lot of really terrible things that foreign governments are doing all around the world, often to their own people. In Latin America, for example, we had some evidence of, I forget exactly the details of what atrocities we had uncovered. But this, of course, included U.S. allies and stuff, too. But they kept this all secret. And so I just think that's interesting. Not to say that the government should have necessarily, the U.S. should not have necessarily intervened to stop these things. We can usually only make things worse when we do that. But still, this information could have still informed some policy changes. Maybe if it's a U.S. ally doing these things, maybe we could have stopped giving them aid or, cut them off from certain things. But nonetheless, this is sort of just another aspect of this whole thing, is that having all these devices under their control, they were privy to all this crazy, all these atrocities and, did nothing about them. But this thing kind of wrapped up in just recently, actually. And so after a crypto AG employee was arrested in Iran in the 1990s over suspicions he was involved in this crazy sweeping spying project, which he was, the Germans kind of bailed out of the operation because they ended up having to pay all this money to the Iranians to get them to free this employee. And the CIA called this a storm of publicity, just created this huge, public scandal. However, the CIA did not stop after the BND bowed out in the 90s. They just bought up Germany's share in the company, and they just kept it going until 2018. And so they ran this for 48 years. And like I said, they sold off, they liquidated the company in 2018, and now someone else owns it. It's not totally clear to me whether the CIA entirely ever stopped dealing with this company, but at least that's officially what they said happened. But at this point, by 2018, encryption technology had totally changed. It had become way more widespread. And crypto AG had kind of lost its prestige and it lost its top place in this field. And so at that point, it wasn't really as useful to the CIA as it was before anyway. Previously, this is the premier company for these encryption devices. Whereas now with the internet and all this new technology, it's really not that, not as necessary as before. But either way, all throughout this 50-year operation, the BND and the CIA made millions of dollars from this. It was a profitable concern, this crypto AG company. And they took that money and they used it as a black budget to finance their field operation. And so it's just, that's a fascinating thing. How many other front companies are like that, where the CIA has this secret black budget to finance whatever they want to do around the world that has nothing to do with, Congress or lawmakers, controlling having the power of the purse. They can kind of do their own fundraising through things like this. And of course, the CIA also used some of its own proceeds from this Rubicon operation to buy up other cryptography firms. So they're trying to corner this market and funnel everyone into crypto AG so that they could spy on them. And so I think that's a funny little aspect of it. But knowing what we do now about the NSA and stuff, this is not all that shocking, the government intelligence agency spying, on a vast scale. But it does just show that they've been doing this kind of thing for a long time. It goes way back to the 70s and even before. And I would say crypto AG is nowhere near what the NSA has pulled off nowadays in terms of mass surveillance of thousands or millions of people. But I would say it's not entirely dissimilar to things the NSA does today, what they were doing with this crypto AG. finding ways to install these like secret backdoors and vulnerabilities in communications technology. The CIA did this to governments on a pretty wide scale, and the NSA is now doing this to our entire society, like building backdoors into our devices and stuff. So it's sort of, there are some parallels today, with the NSA compared to this crypto AG thing.
Yeah, great point, Will, that, if nothing else, even though this is in the past now, it does definitely serve as a warning, especially as, we're in the internet age and, trying to figure out what we want to do with encryption and backdoors and making sure our files are secure, most importantly from our own government. So, Will, thanks for coming back on the show so much and, talking about all these stories that I didn't get to that week that I missed, and there's so much important stuff in here, and I hope you have to back you. I hope I have you back on the show again soon. Why don't you tell people where to check out your work?
Yeah, sure. And I'll send you the links to all these stories. I covered all these things at RT, and I'll let you put those in the show notes. But if you guys want to find more of my work, like Kyle mentioned right at the beginning of the show, it's probably easiest to go to my Twitter handle. I share everything that I write there. At WKP ANCAP, ANCAP. But you can find other writing of mine at the Libertarian Institute on occasion, at some of my older stuff at antiwar.com. It's been a minute since I've been there. I got a few at Consortium News. I've got like 100 or so pieces at a site called the Daily Sheeple. But yeah, primarily I am doing staff writer stuff at RT. And so you can find that on my Twitter handle.
All right, well, thanks.
All right, take care.